The initial buyout offer. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit conference room of the Tri-County Municipal Development Authority, the laughter wasn't booming or cartoonish, it was a series of dismissed, patronizing chuckles from men in mid-tier tailored suits. To them, she was a cliché, a grieving widow clinging to a dilapidated, 70-acre farmstead just outside the expanding city grid. The offer on the table was $420,000, a sum that the regional director, Marcus Vance, no relation, assured her was nearly 20% above the appraised agricultural market value. They told her she was being emotional, that progress was an incoming tide, and that an elderly woman living alone on acreage she could no longer farm was simply standing in the way of the inevitable. But Evelyn didn't blink. She quietly slid the paperwork back across the mahogany table, adjusted her reading glasses, and said a single sentence that would later haunt their legal department: "Your appraisal measures the dirt, gentlemen, but it completely ignores the trajectory." The contrast between how the public perceived Evelyn Vance and who she actually was formed the foundation of their miscalculation. To the local news outlets and the township board, she was merely the widow of Arthur Vance, a quiet man who had spent 40 years running a modest diesel repair shop on the edge of the property. When Arthur passed away from sudden cardiac arrest 14 months prior, the local real estate sharks smelled blood in the water. In a rapidly gentrifying county where suburban sprawl was eating up old homesteads like wildfire, an isolated widow with rising property taxes is usually a guaranteed seller. The local gossip columns painted her refusal as a tragic case of sentimental paralysis, a woman unable to let go of the past, stubborn to the point of financial suicide. The township even initiated preliminary discussions regarding an eminent domain seizure for public utility expansion, a move designed to scare her into compliance by threatening a lower, court-mandated payout. What the Tri-County Development Authority failed to realize was that Evelyn Vance was not a victim of sentimental paralysis, she was a retired senior compliance auditor for the Federal Highway Administration. For 32 years, her entire career had been dedicated to analyzing state infrastructure budgets, mapping out right-of-way acquisitions, and identifying the exact moments where local municipalities attempted to obscure federal funding allocations to benefit private developers. She knew how bureaucratic machinery operated because she had spent her life maintaining and policing its gears. When her husband Arthur was alive, they had deliberately kept the farm under a specific agricultural conservation easement that restricted commercial zoning, a legal shield that the city's attorneys assumed they could easily dissolve with a standard municipal variance. The turning point occurred on a rainy Tuesday morning in late October, just 3 days before the city's final deadline for voluntary acquisition. Evelyn sat at her kitchen table, illuminated only by a single amber lamp and the glow of her laptop screen. While the city's legal team was busy preparing condemnation papers based on standard urban expansion codes, Evelyn was digging through the State Department of Transportation's public disclosure portal, cross-referencing obscure municipal bond issues with federal environmental impact reports. That was when she noticed the anomaly. A seemingly routine state highway expansion project, officially designated as a minor bypass route to alleviate commuter traffic, had suddenly received a massive, quiet infusion of secondary funding under an interstate commerce infrastructure grant. The paperwork listed the project as a simple widening of Route 9, a road that ran parallel to Evelyn's eastern property line. However, the engineering schematics buried deep within the appendix of the state's 5-year transportation plan revealed a radically different reality. The proposed bypass wasn't a standard 2-lane commuter relief road. It was being redesigned into a massive, 4-lane commercial freight corridor complete with a designated high-capacity logistics interchange. And the exact center point of that proposed interchange, the critical junction where a massive regional distribution hub would need to connect to the state highway system, sat directly on top of the 30 acres containing Arthur's old diesel repair shop. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with chilling precision. The Tri-County Development Authority wasn't trying to acquire her land for a public park, a municipal water treatment facility, or basic urban green space. They were acting as an undisclosed clearinghouse for a major, multi-state logistics corporation that needed that specific parcel of land to secure their supply chain network. By purchasing her land at depressed agricultural rates under the guise of standard municipal growth, the city could turn around, rezone the property overnight, and transfer the right-of-way to the private developer at a staggering premium, pocketing the difference through local development bonds while cutting Evelyn out of the true economic value of her inheritance. They thought she was a helpless widow who didn't know the difference between a property tax assessment and a commercial infrastructure valuation. They were about to find out exactly how expensive that assumption was going to be. With the engineering schematics printed out and spread across her living room floor, Evelyn began the meticulous process of building her counteroffensive. In the world of high-stakes municipal development, emotion is a liability, but verifiable documentation is an absolute weapon. She knew that simply accusing the Tri-County Development Authority of collusion would achieve nothing. They would dismiss her as a conspiracy theorist, rush their eminent domain filing through a friendly local magistrate, and tie her up in costly litigation for years until her savings were entirely depleted. To beat them, she had to let them proceed with their plan under the false assumption that they were completely undetected, allowing them to sign their names to legally binding commitments that she could later exploit. The first step was analyzing the structure of the upcoming public hearing. The Township Board had scheduled a final vote on the Route 9 Infrastructure Enhancement Initiative for the second Tuesday of November. On paper, this meeting was framed as a routine bureaucratic formality, a chance for the community to voice minor concerns about construction noise and traffic detours before the board voted to approve the land acquisitions. But Evelyn's research revealed a far more sinister timeline. By reviewing the public minutes of the State Transportation Committee, she discovered that the federal infrastructure grant had a strict, ready-to-commence clause. If the local municipality could not secure all necessary rights-of-way by December 1, the federal funding would automatically expire and revert back to the central treasury. This meant the Tri-County Development Authority wasn't operating from a position of absolute power, they were operating under severe, desperate time constraints. Their patronizing laughter in the boardroom hadn't been an expression of calm confidence. It was a psychological defense mechanism designed to mask their mounting panic. They needed Evelyn's land, and they needed it within the next 3 weeks, or the entire multi-million-dollar logistics corridor project would collapse like a house of cards. This realization shifted the entire balance of power. Evelyn was no longer an obstacle trying to survive a municipal bulldozer, she was the gatekeeper holding the keys to their entire financial future. To confirm her suspicions regarding the private logistics corporation, Evelyn leveraged her knowledge of freedom of information laws. She filed an expedited public records request with the state's Department of Commerce, targeting all communications between the regional director, Evelyn Vance, and a Delaware-registered limited liability company called Apex Meridian Logistics. Because the request was filed under strict federal transparency guidelines relating to projects receiving interstate commerce funding, the local office could not legally ignore it without triggering an immediate federal compliance audit. 4 days later, a thick manila envelope arrived on Evelyn's doorstep. Inside were hundreds of pages of heavily redacted emails, but the redactions were sloppy. By holding the pages up to a bright light, Evelyn could clearly read the unredacted headers and subject lines. The correspondence revealed that Evelyn Vance had been in direct communication with Apex Meridian's chief acquisitions officer for over 18 months. In fact, the city had entered into a confidential memorandum of understanding with the private corporation a full 6 months before they ever approached Evelyn with their initial buyout offer. The city had promised to deliver the 70-acre farmstead fully cleared and rezoned for industrial use, in exchange for a projected $20 million corporate investment in the township's new commercial tax district. Armed with this undeniable proof of institutional bad faith, Evelyn decided to play her opening gambit. Instead of hiring a flashy, expensive trial lawyer who would immediately tip off the city's legal team, she contacted an old colleague from her days at the Federal Highway Administration, a quiet, brilliant administrative law attorney named Thomas Miller. Thomas understood the dense, dry vocabulary of federal transport codes better than anyone in the state. When Evelyn laid out the timeline, the engineering schematics, and the unredacted emails on his desk, Thomas let out a low whistle. They didn't just bend the rules, Evelyn, he whispered, looking up through his bifocals. They completely bypassed the National Environmental Policy Act. By masking a private commercial freight hub as a public safety road widening project, they committed material misrepresentation on a federal funding application. That isn't just a municipal violation, that's a federal administrative offense. Thomas explained that if they filed a formal injunction in federal court, the judge would immediately freeze all state and local funding for the project pending a full administrative review. Such a review would take a minimum of 9 to 12 months to complete. For the Tri-County Development Authority, a 12-month delay was a death sentence. It would push them way past their December 1st deadline, causing the federal grant to expire, and prompting Apex Meridian Logistics to pull out of the deal entirely to look for an alternative site in a neighboring county. Evelyn had them completely cornered, but she didn't want to just stop the project. She wanted to ensure that the true value of Arthur's legacy was recognized, and that the individuals who tried to bully her were held publicly accountable for their deception. Together, Evelyn and Thomas drafted a comprehensive legal response, carefully keeping it under wraps until the exact moment it would inflict the maximum possible damage. The evening of the final township board meeting arrived with an air of orchestrated predictability. The municipal auditorium was packed with local residents, civil engineers, and subcontractors, many of whom had been subtly incentivized by the local Chamber of Commerce to attend and applaud the approval of the Route 9 project. At the front of the room, seated behind an elevated dais, the 5 township trustees sat alongside Marcus Vance, the regional director. Marcus looked entirely at ease, occasionally leaning over to whisper to the board president, a local real estate developer named Donald Henderson. To anyone watching, the meeting was a done deal, a mere bureaucratic formality before the inevitable rubber stamp. When the floor was finally open for public comment, Marcus Vance took the microphone to present a polished, slide-based overview of the project. He spoke eloquently about reducing commuter gridlock, enhancing local emergency vehicle response times, and creating hundreds of temporary construction jobs. He frames the acquisition of the surrounding properties as a necessary sacrifice for the greater communal good. We have negotiated fairly and generously with almost every property owner along the corridor, Marcus stated, his voice echoing smoothly through the PA system. Unfortunately, a single holdout remains on a critical parcel of land. While we deeply respect our senior citizens and their emotional ties to the past, the township cannot allow sentimental obstinacy to derail the economic future of our entire community. Therefore, if the final voluntary acquisition cannot be finalized tonight, we will be forced to vote on an emergency resolution to proceed with eminent domain condemnation. A murmur of agreement rippled through the front rows, where several local business owners sat. Marcus smiled, believing he had successfully painted Evelyn Vance as a selfish, out-of-touch obstacle to progress. He looked toward the middle row, where Evelyn sat quietly in a plain gray trench coat, her hands folded neatly over a thick canvas tote bag. "Mrs. Vance," Marcus said, adopting a tone of patronizing warmth, "the board is still willing to honor our initial offer of $420,000 if you sign the voluntary easement transfer tonight. We want to avoid the unpleasantness of a court-ordered seizure just as much as you do." Evelyn stood up slowly, adjusting her glasses. She didn't walk to the microphone in the center aisle. Instead, Thomas Miller stood up beside her, carrying a portable projector and a high-speed laser printer interface connected to a laptop. With a calm, practiced efficiency that stunned the room into absolute silence, Thomas bypassed the auditorium's secure media feed and projected a high-resolution document directly onto the massive white wall right above the trustees' heads. It was the unredacted engineering schematic of the 4-lane commercial freight corridor and the Apex Meridian Logistics interchange. "Thank you, Director Vance," Evelyn's voice was remarkably clear, carrying an absolute authority that instantly cut through the room's tension. "But before we discuss voluntary transfers, I believe the community deserves a clear explanation of what this project actually is. As the former senior compliance auditor for the Federal Highway Administration, I find your public presentation regarding commuter traffic relief to be completely fraudulent. The document currently projected behind you is not a commuter road widening plan. It is a specialized, heavy-duty industrial logistics infrastructure layout designed specifically to accommodate Class 8 commercial freight trucks." The smile instantly vanished from Marcus Vance's face. His skin turned a sickly shade of ash white as he stared up at the wall. Donald Henderson, the board president, slammed his gavel down onto the wooden dais. "Mrs. Vance, you are out of order. This is a public comment period. Not a platform for wild, unverified conspiracy theories. Turn off that projector immediately or I will have code enforcement escort you from the building." "I am entirely in order, Mr. Henderson," Evelyn replied calmly, completely unfazed by the threat. "And if you look at the lower right-hand corner of that schematic, you will see your own signature, alongside that of Director Vance, authorizing the non-disclosure agreement with Apex Meridian Logistics LLC. Furthermore, my counsel has just electronically filed a formal administrative complaint with the Office of the Inspector General at the Department of Transportation, alongside an emergency motion for a federal injunction in the Eastern District Court. Thomas Miller stepped forward, handing a freshly printed stack of stamped legal documents to the bailiff, who looked bewildered as he passed them up to the trembling hands of the trustees. For the benefit of the public record, Evelyn continued, her voice cutting through the rising panic on the dais, the Tri-County Development Authority has committed material misrepresentation on a federal grant application. You claimed this was a public safety project to obtain federal highway funds, while secretly contracting to flip my 70-acre property to a private multi-state corporation for $24 million. Because you violated the National Environmental Policy Act and failed to disclose the commercial nature of the interchange, a federal judge has signed a temporary restraining order. As of exactly 20 minutes ago, all municipal bonds and state funding allocations for the Route 9 project are legally frozen. The silence that followed Evelyn's declaration was absolute, broken only by the hum of the portable projector cooling fan. On the dais, Donald Henderson sat with his mouth slightly open, the wooden gavel held limply in his hand. Marcus Vance was staring at the stamped federal court injunction in front of him as if it were a live explosive. The local business owners in the front rows, who moments earlier had been whispering and nodding in agreement with the board, were now turning around in their seats to stare at Evelyn with an entirely new expression, one of profound, sudden realization. They weren't watching an old widow lose her home, they were watching an elite auditor systematically dismantle a multi-million-dollar corporate conspiracy in real time. "This meeting is adjourned," Henderson stammered, his voice cracking slightly into the microphone. "We are going into an immediate executive session with municipal council." "You can adjourn the public hearing, Mr. Henderson," Thomas Miller spoke up, his voice echoing clearly across the room. "But you cannot adjourn a federal restraining order. The clock is officially ticking. As you know, the federal infrastructure grant powering this entire corridor expires on December 1st. Today is November 12th. You have exactly 18 days to resolve this administrative dispute, or the state funding reverts back to the Central Treasury, Apex Meridian's development contract voids automatically, and the township becomes legally liable for the millions of dollars in municipal bonds you have already issued to clear the surrounding rights-of-way." Before the trustees could even gather their paperwork, Evelyn and Thomas turned and walked out of the auditorium, leaving a chaotic swarm of shouting residents and stunned reporters in their wake. They didn't wait for a statement. Nor did they answer the frantic questions from local journalists who followed them to Thomas's car. Evelyn knew that the real battle wouldn't happen in front of a camera, it would happen behind closed doors where the true weight of financial ruin would finally force the city's hand. The next morning, the fallout was catastrophic for the Tri-County Development Authority. The local newspaper's front page featured a massive headline detailing the federal freeze, accompanied by a crystal-clear screenshot of the unredacted corporate schematics. By noon, shares of the major construction firms tied to the municipal bonds began to dip, and rumors circulated that the regional director of the Department of Transportation had called a mandatory emergency meeting. The patronizing chuckles from the previous month had completely vanished, replaced by a desperate, high-stakes scramble for survival. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Thomas Miller's office phone rang. It was the lead outside counsel for the Tri-County Development Authority, requesting an immediate, off-the-record settlement conference. The meeting took place 48 hours later in a neutral conference room at the county courthouse. This time, the atmosphere was entirely different. There were no smirking directors or condescending remarks about an elderly woman's emotional attachments. Marcus Vance wasn't even allowed in the room. He had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal compliance investigation. Instead, Evelyn and Thomas faced a team of 4 senior corporate attorneys and the state's Deputy Secretary of Transportation. The lead attorney, a sharp-featured man named Richard Sterling, wasted no time. He slid a fresh, legally binding settlement agreement across the table toward Evelyn. "Mrs. Vance, we are prepared to completely bypass the original appraisal. The Tri-County Development Authority, with corporate backing from Apex Meridian, is prepared to offer you an adjusted, non-negotiable buyout of $3.5 million for the 70-acre parcel. This is nearly 8 times the initial offer. In exchange, you will sign the voluntary land transfer today, and your counsel will immediately withdraw the federal administrative complaint, allowing the infrastructure funding to unlock. Evelyn looked down at the document, then back up at Sterling. She didn't touch the paper. Mr. Sterling, you are still operating under the delusion that I am negotiating out of a need for money. $3.5 million is a substantial amount of money for a standard agricultural property, but it is a drop in the bucket compared to the $24 million valuation your secret memorandum assigned to the logistics hub interchange. You tried to use the threat of eminent domain to steal an asset under fraudulent pretenses, and you put my late husband's name in local gossip columns as an obstacle to progress. What do you want, Mrs. Vance? The Deputy Secretary of Transportation asked, his voice strained with exhaustion. If that funding expires on December 1st, nobody wins. The land stays a farm, the township goes into massive bond debt, and you get nothing but a long, expensive legal battle to protect an empty diesel shop. I want compliance, and I want accuracy, Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a calm, icy register. First, the project will be officially renamed on all state and federal registries as the Arthur Vance Memorial Logistics Corridor. Second, my husband's shop and the surrounding 5 acres will not be demolished. They will be legally partitioned out of the sale, designated as a historical county landmark, and deeded to a local vocational trust to provide scholarships for young diesel mechanics. Third, for the remaining 65 acres, you will pay the true, unredacted commercial market value. She paused, placing her hands flat on the table. Which my independent forensic accountants have calculated to be exactly $9,750,000. Richard Sterling stared at the figure written on the notepad in front of him. $9,750,000. The room was deathly quiet, save for the rhythmic clicking of a ballpoint pen held by one of the junior associates. The Deputy Secretary of Transportation buried his face in his hands, mentally calculating the remaining days until the December 1st deadline. The corporate attorneys exchanged rapid, panicked glances. They were trapped in a mathematical vice. If they refused Evelyn's terms, the federal grant would completely vanish in exactly 12 days, triggering a cascade of structural defaults, investor lawsuits, and municipal bankruptcies that would cost their clients 10 times that amount. That is an astronomical premium above standard regional land values, Sterling said, his voice stripped of all its former corporate bravado. We would need immediate authorization from the corporate board of Apex Meridian to approve a disbursement of that magnitude on such short notice. Then I suggest you call them, Mr. Sterling, Thomas Miller replied, checking his watch with a deliberate calmness. It is currently 2:15 in the afternoon. The Federal Regional Office closes its digital filing portal at 5 o'clock sharp. If a signed, fully executed settlement and a formal withdrawal of our administrative complaint are not uploaded by 4:30, the temporary restraining order remains in place through the weekend. By Monday, the timeline to unlock the funds before the December 1st expiration becomes mathematically impossible. Sterling stood up without another word, signaling his team to follow him into the hallway. For the next 45 minutes, the muffled sounds of frantic, high-stakes negotiations echoed through the heavy frosted glass doors of the courthouse conference room. Evelyn sat perfectly still, sipping a cup of black coffee she had brought from home. She felt no anxiety, no rush of adrenaline. And absolutely no malice. To her, this was simply the final, inevitable calculation of a lifetime spent analyzing bureaucratic systems. She had found the structural flaw in their design, applied the exact amount of legal leverage required, and now she was simply waiting for the machinery to yield. At exactly 3:15, the legal team re-entered the room. Sterling looked physically exhausted, his tie loosened and his forehead glistening under the fluorescent lights. He did not sit down. Instead, he placed a heavily amended contract on the table, complete with 3 freshly printed addendums bearing the digital signature stamps of Apex Meridian's Corporate Executive Committee. They approved it, Sterling said quietly. $9,750,000 for the 65 acres. The remaining 5 acres containing the diesel shop are permanently partitioned and deeded to the vocational trust. The State Department of Transportation has already updated the project registry. The corridor will be officially dedicated as the Arthur Vance Memorial Logistics Infrastructure Network. He slid a gold sign pen across the table toward Evelyn. We need your signature on the voluntary easement transfer and the federal withdrawal forms. Right now. Evelyn picked up her reading glasses, carefully reviewing every single line, every clause, and every punctuation mark of the amended documents. She ensured that the legal descriptions of the property boundaries were precise to the millimeter, leaving absolutely no room for future municipal zoning tricks or hidden variances. Once she was completely satisfied that the legacy of her late husband was permanently protected and that the city had been forced into total compliance, she firmly signed her name at the bottom of each page. Thomas Miller immediately scanned the executed documents, opened his laptop, and uploaded the files directly to the federal court's electronic registry. A few minutes later, a chime indicated that the administrative complaint had been officially withdrawn, and the federal restraining order was lifted. The multi-million-dollar logistics corridor was saved, but it was no longer a monument to corporate greed, it was a testament to a widow's absolute precision. 6 months later, the construction crews arrived on the edge of the property. But they didn't touch the old diesel repair shop. A neat, wrought iron fence had been erected around the 5-acre parcel, and a polished bronze plaque stood at the entrance, bearing the name of Arthur Vance. Inside, the first class of local high school graduates was already learning the trade, funded entirely by the newly established vocational trust. Beyond the fence line, massive earth movers and paving machines were hard at work, laying down the heavy-duty concrete foundations for the state-of-the-art logistics interchange. Marcus Vance was no longer the regional director. He had resigned from public service following a scathing internal audit that exposed his undisclosed corporate communications. The local developers who had once sat on the township dais chuckling at an elderly woman's stubbornness now had to drive past the massive road signs every single day, reading the words, Arthur Vance Memorial Corridor, in bold, reflective letters. They had laughed because they believed that an isolated individual with an emotional attachment to the land was an easy target for institutional bullying. They learned, at an incredible financial and reputational cost, that the most dangerous person in the room is not the one with the loudest voice or the biggest budget. It is the one who quietly understands the rules of the system better than the people who wrote them. Evelyn Vance had protected her home, honored her husband's memory, and forced a multi-million-dollar machine to pay exactly what his legacy was worth.